continuation of my history as a car guy segment, we will be looking at my post-teen years, where I have a steady job, a wife, a child, an apartment, and no money. Technically, I did have a car, a 1965 Plymouth Barracuda. It was a car I bought from a friend of mine that had owned it since he got his driver's license. He was moving to Alaska and needed a few bucks for travel expenses, so I gave him a few bucks in exchange for the car. His car was not in great shape. It had been in at least 3 accidents that I was aware of, which included a rollover in the snow, a Dukes of Hazzard style launch into a log pond, after which it had to be towed out of 3 feet of water, and it had hit at least one tree, an incident which I happened to be in the passenger seat of at the time. It had the 4-speed with a Hurst shifter and an Elkhorn as the shift knob, but you had to hold it into gear or it would pop into neutral. The floorboards were a piece of plywood that was wedged between the body and the frame, and it had tiny little 13-inch rims off of a Corvair on the front. The 273 V8 got yanked out and dropped into a 69 Dart after the original 318 in that broke a valve. So when some guy came knocking on my door and offered me $800 for the back window, I let him take the whole car, or what there was left of it. This was not a car I was using as a daily driver at any point, and I was getting tired of borrowing my mother-in-law's purple Chevette. So with $300 that I got from my dad, I bought a Mazda 808 Grand Familia Coupe that had been for sale just down the road from my apartment. For those of you that are unfamiliar with this vehicle, it's essentially a Mazda RX-3, but without the rotary. Instead, it had a 1.6-liter inline-4 that was optimistically rated at somewhere around 80 horsepower. This was my first import car, and it did not make any friends. In spite of its lightweight and lack of performance, the brakes often overheated. Not only was it the slowest car that I've ever owned, in spite of having the manual transmission, but it seemed to be designed specifically to prevent people from working on it. When the plastic ignition switch stripped out, I couldn't figure out how to get the steering column off, so I did something I never had to do before: buy a repair manual. And to my surprise, step 1 was get a hacksaw. What I had thought were rivets were actually bolts with rounded heads on them, and to take them off, you were expected to get a hacksaw into this small slot, cut a slot in it, and take them off with a flat-tip screwdriver. And it turned out that the repair manual was not a waste of money, because I ended up having to revert to it repeatedly. When the horn quit working, I didn't even bother to try to fix it. Instead, I just mounted a sound effect machine under the dash attached to a speaker behind the grille. And although there is a certain amount of satisfaction of laser and machine gun sounds in heavy traffic, it doesn't really function well as a horn. But when the timing chain gave out and I couldn't get the thing apart, I called in my brother-in-law, the certified mechanic, and he basically said, just shoot it. So I just scrapped the thing. My next car would be the first car that I would finance, and the first car that I paid over $1,000 for. That's right, $1,200 in 6 months of payments for a 1979 Chrysler LeBaron. This car was super clean and had low mileage, and even with the 318, averaged almost 20 miles to the gallon. Wasn't very pretty, but it was almost like having a super well-equipped Dart. Due to my super aggressive driving on the back roads to work every day, wasn't long before I was losing the hubcaps, so I upgraded to some chrome steel wheels. But after I'd had the car for quite a while, things started to go wrong. First off, it was hit in the parking lot. We came out of the store to find the rear quarter panel dented in and the chrome trim ripped off. And of course, the insurance company said that our full coverage was based on the requirements of the finance company, which apparently didn't include uninsured motorists, so they weren't going to do anything. Not long after that, the rear end blew out, which I just used as an excuse to drop in some 323 gears, which made the performance much more lively, while only reducing the mileage to somewhere around 18 miles to the gallon. But then it started dying at random. When it died, it wouldn't restart for 15 to 20 minutes. But when it did restart, it would run perfectly as nothing had ever happened. Took it to 3 different shops. None of them seemed to be able to figure it out. Much later, I discovered that this was actually a common issue on Chryslers of this period, and a simple $30 electrical component on the firewall would resolve the issue. But I had already given up on the car before I discovered this, because one day, in a crowded intersection, it died blocking traffic from both ways. So I pushed it into the nearest lot. It happened to be a used car dealership, and they convinced me to trade it and $400 for another car. And during the time that I had this car, my hand had gotten crushed in a mill accident, and after recovering from reconstructive surgery, I got a small settlement. So I did what any good redneck would do. I bought a rifle and a pickup truck with a rifle rack. The rifle was a 303 British, and the pickup was a 1965 Dodge D100 short flatbed. It had the wide block 318. The original 3 on the tree had been replaced by a granny low 4-speed. It had a 410 rear end, and somebody had welded in a set of heavy-duty coil springs in addition to the factory leaf springs. The back end of this truck was rock solid, which is good because the 32 by 10.5 back tires had about an inch of clearance on both the top and the side. Both the inside and the outside had a surface rust patina, and somebody had put orange shag carpet in it. So I redid the interior, easy to do when the seat's the only thing that's not metal, and sanded and primered the outside in a camouflage pattern. I also connected an old wooden waterbed frame to the bed, so I had a place in back to throw stuff without it falling off. This truck was so low geared that you typically only use 3rd and 4th gears, 3rd to take off in, and once you were rolling, just shift it into 4th and leave it there. Had a top speed of about 65 miles an hour. In 2nd, it would climb a tree, and Granny Low was so low that you'd wind it out and not reach 5 miles an hour. A friend of mine had suggested that if I had wound it out and popped the clutch that it would probably do a smoky burnout. So I tried that, and it did not do a smoky burnout. In fact, it did not move forward at all. The front end of the truck went straight up and straight back down. How far up, I couldn't say, but when you can't see over the top of the hood, the front wheels are clearly too far off the ground. After a few years, I sold the truck to my brother, who drove it for about half a year, let it sit over the winter, and it popped a freeze plug. So I bought it back from him, continued to drive it for a while, and then sold it to a body shop who insisted it was the perfect parts runner for throwing fenders on the back of, and said they were going to paint it candy apple red. A few years later, I get a call from a tow yard in Vancouver, Washington, that tells me it's been impounded and I'm still the registered owner and am required by Washington law to go pick it up. So I called my brother and we head up there with his new truck towing a flatbed trailer, and to my surprise, the cab was candy apple red. Even more to my surprise, it had been lowered with 14-inch low-profile Keystone Classic wheels on it, and a step-side bed that was Forestry Service green, a bed that was piled cab-high with car parts, including the carbon air cleaner from the truck. But, as it turned out, as I was not a resident of the state and not the current owner, I was not required to pay the impound fees, and as I was still living in an apartment and already had 3 vehicles, I opted not to, although at a certain level, I kind of wish that I'd had. So, you may be asking, what did I trade the LeBaron for? Well, I traded it for a 1981 Ford Escort Glx station wagon. It was very nicely equipped, but still had the 5-speed. It was silver and very generic looking, so I'd put on some black and gray stripes that I got from J.C. Whitney to distinguish it, and it turned out to be one of the worst cars I've ever owned. I only had the car for about 6 months, and over that time, the cruise control quit working, the power windows quit working, the rear defogger quit working, the exhaust fell off the car, front wheel bearing went out. When I bought the car, my dad asked me why I would buy an Escort. I said, well, it's the best-selling small car in America since its introduction. They must be doing something right. But as it turns out, I can't imagine what that was. So I traded it in. I traded it for a 1983 Chevy Impala 9C1, better known as the police package. This car had been an active K9 unit, had the rubber floor mat, and had recently been reupholstered, including its front bucket seats with a shotgun rack between them. This was a 350 4-barrel 4-speed automatic car, and it had the lights mounted behind the grille. And in spite of, or perhaps because of, the upgraded suspension and tires that came with the police package, this was the easiest car I've ever owned to drift. And the fact that it looked like pretty much every other cop car that was still on the road, had both its good and bad points. The good point was that cops tended to ignore the car. In fact, if they did give it a second look, it was just to wave. And in all the time that I owned that car, I only got pulled over once, and in that case, I was all but daring the guy to pull me over. Of course, the flip side of that is everybody else thinks it's a cop car too. You pull out on the freeway, and suddenly everybody's doing 50 miles an hour. Twice, I actually had people pull over. Once when doing a U-turn, and once when I followed a Porsche 911 into a parking lot because we just happened to be going to the same place. I absolutely loved that car. But then the engine management system went out, and according to all the parts places in my area, the only engine that came in that car was a 305 with a 2-barrel. And they didn't even make a Corvette that year. I was advised, try the dealer. But according to the dealer, I needed some kind of special certification to order those kinds of parts. The car still drove, but you put your foot into it and it would start stuttering and bucking. So really, if you wanted to go anywhere, you had to drive like a little old lady. Eventually, I sold the car to a mechanic who was confident that he could get it fixed. Eventually. Now, during the time that I had this car, I had started carpooling with a neighbor/friend of mine as we were both driving big V8 cars that didn't get very good gas mileage. In this case, a 79 Bonneville with 301. When I ran across an ad for the local Chevy dealership that had taken in a 78 Pinto station wagon and was selling it for $99. Had some issues with the automatic transmission in the sense that when it shifted into gear, there would be a slight delay followed by a hard thunk, which at takeoff often meant that the tires would chirp. It had the big 2.3 liter. Somebody had redid the interior in red velour, had air shocks on the back, and the silver paint was peeling. Sanded it down, primered it, blacked out the trim, and used it for several years as a commuter car. One point, rear wheel bearing seized up. Had a friend that had a Mustang that had previously been a 2.3 liter that was just sitting around with no engine. She said we could take any parts off it we wanted, so we took the whole rear axle and all the Mustang 2 trim pieces that we could swap over from one car to the other. Mostly just because we thought it was funny. After having the car for a number of years, I sold it to my brother for $300. He drove the car for a couple of years before selling it to one of his in-laws for $800. After selling the Impala, I just bought the cheapest car that I could find that was a good runner. In this case, a 1975 Plymouth Grand Fury Suburban. This would be the biggest car that I would ever own, being both longer and heavier than my 69 DeVille. The only real feature that it had was a power back window. The car was powered by a big block 400 that someone had dressed up with an Edelbrock carbon manifold, Mickey Thompson finned aluminum valve covers, and a chrome air cleaner. When you punched it in this car, the engine would literally roar to life. The ass end would hunch down, there would be a brief argument with the law of physics, and then it would leisurely accelerate. Even all this amount of torque was no match for 2.5 tons of station wagon. And we averaged like 10 miles per gallon of the thing, and the wife hated it. A slow, poorly equipped gas hog that was hard to park? What's not to like? It was about this time that I decided to try another street bike. Searching the classifieds, I found a relatively cheap CB400 Hawk in really great shape. It wasn't very fast, but got great gas mileage, was super reliable, and I rode it every time the weather was nice enough that I felt I could get away with it. I had the bike for a number of years and had pretty much no problems with it. On the ride home after I'd purchased it, a rear turn signal lens had fallen off, so I had to find a new one, which turned out to be pretty easy and cheap. I once forgot to put the kickstand up and broke it off at about 50 miles an hour, so that had to be welded back on. And at one point I had put a windscreen on it, but that got broke during an earthquake, so I had to take it back off. I don't even remember why I sold that bike, but I remember missing it once it was gone. But it couldn't be used as a family vehicle, so the Grand Fury had to go. So while looking through the classifieds, I ran across those "we'll buy any running vehicle for this amount of money." I think it was somewhere in the neighborhood of around $500. And I noticed it was just a couple of miles from a place that advertised super cheap cars on late night TV, usually on a Saturday night right after Portland wrestling. Some guy with a thick Eastern European accent that would just be standing in front of a green screen of interstate traffic, and he would say something like, "You need car cheap? I sell you one maybe like one of these." Seemed super legit, so I drove up to Portland, got my cash for my Grand Fury, hoofed it the couple miles to the other address, which turned out to be a little office with a dozen cars wedged bumper to bumper in the alley behind it. Pickings were slim, but I opted for a 1975 Chrysler Cordova lowrider. It was bright red with a white Landau top and a white leather interior, 360 V8, Keystone Classics on the front, and Coke bottle Kragers on the back. Custom taillight lenses, and all the electrical switches were missing with just wires hanging out where they were supposed to be. And when I brought this car home, my wife threw a fit. So that, combined with the bright red color, earned it the nickname Hellraiser. But a couple miles from my house, I knew where there was a wrecked Cordova, and I thought I could convince the guy to sell me parts off of it. Turned out he wasn't willing to part it out, but he was willing to sell me the whole car super cheap. And it ran and drive. It was emerald green inside and out, had the high output 400, which apparently had been too much for the guy's daughter as she spun out and slammed it into a guardrail and bashed in the whole front end. So he took me back in the field, fired it right up, but while we were discussing how cheap he was willing to let it go for, thought it started smoking. Turns out it wasn't smoking. It had caught the grass on fire. We were way too far from the house to get a hose to reach out there, so he ran into the house to call the fire department while I drove the car out of the flames and attempted to stomp the fire out, which I actually succeeded at doing, but not before we had burnt a 60-foot circle in the grass, caught my shoe on fire, and ended up with second-degree burns on my foot. The damage to the car proved to be mostly cosmetic, and I probably could have fixed it for a few $100. But in the end, I just ended up stripping all the parts off of it and putting what I could use on the other car. According to friends and neighbors, putting green cars on a red and white car makes it look like a Christmas tree decoration. I also transferred the factory wheels and tires and taillight lenses, giving it a stock look again instead of the custom lowrider look. But it was a much nicer driving car afterwards. And it was shortly after buying this car, we moved into a house with a garage, so I pulled the running gear out of it in hopes of being able to use it for some future hot rod project. No longer living in an apartment, how I viewed and purchased cars was about to change as well. So we will come back to that in our next video.